June 20th into June 21st, 1756. A single windowless room inside Fort William in Calcutta, no larger than a modest bedroom, became, according to the most widely circulated account, the scene of a human disaster. By morning, so the story ran, nearly 150 people had been forced inside and most had died. That version of events, known to history as the Black Hole of Calcutta, shocked British public opinion, fueled demands for revenge, and burned itself into the memory of an empire. But when we peel back the layers of testimony, paperwork, and later reconstruction, a more complicated picture emerges, one that is at once horrifying and uncertain. This is an investigation into what actually happened that night, the event itself, the man who described it, the reasons the story traveled so far and fast, and why modern historians still argue over numbers and motives. If this investigation matters to you, stay with the whole account, and consider subscribing so you don't miss the full unpacking of the sources that follow. To understand the black hole, we must first understand why Calcutta mattered in 1756. Mid-18th century Bengal was extraordinary wealth concentrated in a sprawling, fertile delta. The Mughal Empire's central authority had weakened, and in its place rose powerful regional rulers, Nawabs, who governed wealthy provinces with large revenues and vibrant cities. Bengal's production of silk, muslin, rice, and saltpeter made it an economic prize. European trading companies had been present in the region for decades, and among them the English East India Company stood out not simply as traders seeking spices and textiles, but increasingly as political actors. Fort William, situated in Calcutta, was more than a trading post. It was a fortified compound that protected company officials, warehouses, and guns. Over time, the East India Company's representatives pushed the boundaries of privilege. They claimed exemptions from local customs duties. They built fortifications and bastions without clear consent, and they hosted a semi-autonomous European and Anglo-Indian population that often acted with impunity. That autonomy, and the company's apparent willingness to alter local arrangements in order to protect its interests, irritated and alarmed successive Nawabs. In April 1756, a young man, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, became Nawab of Bengal. He was sensitive to any sign that Calcutta was becoming an enclave beyond his control. High on his list of complaints were the company's unauthorized strengthening of Fort William and the behavior of company officials who, in his view, treated his authority with disdain. Tensions rose through late spring. Diplomatic exchanges failed to resolve the dispute. In June, Siraj decided to assert power by force. By mid-June, Siraj assembled an advancing army around Calcutta. Contemporary observers described the Nawab's forces as numerous, a field army backed by artillery, cavalry, and elephants. The news of the Nawab's approach sparked panic within the city. Many of the company's senior officials fled. The governor and his council left Fort William to seek refuge elsewhere. Into that vacuum stepped a small group of British soldiers, traders, and civilians who for various reasons remained in the fort. Leadership within the remaining defenders fell to a handful of officers, among them John Zephaniah Holwell, who would later become the chief chronicler of the night that followed. On June 20th, 1756, under pressure and apparently to avoid a wholesale massacre in the open streets or a futile last stand, the small body of defenders surrendered to Siraj's forces. The terms of surrender, the precise conditions under which the defenders yielded, and whether promises of protection were given, are points where the record is scattered and sometimes contradictory. What follows, the story of confinement in a small guardroom, is told most fully by Holwell. His account travelled back to Britain and became the defining narrative of the Black Hole. But because Holwell's testimony is the primary, and in many ways the only detailed eyewitness narrative to reach 18th century London, evaluating its reliability is central to our investigation. According to Holwell, after the surrender, a number of British prisoners were gathered and placed in a guardroom, a cell that he later described as roughly 14 feet by 18 feet. Holwell reported that this room had a single barred window or aperture and could not accommodate the numbers that were forced inside. He claimed that the confinement took place during a monsoon night, with fires lit nearby in the compound, which drove heat and smoke into the room. In his telling, the night was a descent into suffocation and disorder, a crush of bodies, fevered attempts to find fresh air at the windows, water passed through the bars to the thirsty, and as the hours passed, the gradual collapse of strength among the imprisoned. Holwell reported the temperature in that room as extraordinarily high, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, an element he used to convey the brutal physical conditions. He wrote in effect that nearly all of those confined perished overnight, and that only 23 emerged the following morning. These are dramatic details, and they make for a visceral scene when read aloud or dramatized on screen, but they come primarily from a single narrator, whose life and motives deserve scrutiny. John Zephaniah Holwell was an East India Company surgeon who in the aftermath became a vocal chronicler of what he had endured. His narrative was published and republished. It reached a British public primed for tales of suffering and outrage, and it helped to crystallize a story of British victimhood in a hostile landscape. Holwell's account features names, figures, and precise sensations, heat, thirst, clinging bodies, that have no direct corroboration from other detailed eyewitness testimony. Other contemporaries mentioned deaths and disorder that night, but none provided the same comprehensive micro-narrative. That raises the first question: how many people were actually put into that guardroom? Holwell's most famous figure, 146 confined, with only 23 surviving, has long dominated popular retellings. It is the number that appears in period broadsides, in parliamentary debate, and in the memorials and histories that followed. Yet historians have been careful to mark that number as Holwell's claim, not as an uncontested census. Later research shifted attention to administrative records that survive in company archives. Muster rolls, garrison lists, and payroll documents provide an independent window into who was officially part of the Fort William garrison or associated civilian staff at the time. Scholars who have combed those records pointed to discrepancies. Some reconstructions based on surviving lists suggested that the number of people likely to have been confined that night was considerably lower. Estimates in mid-20th century studies proposed figures closer to 64, sometimes even fewer. Another line of archival work focused on garrison declarations and reported missing men, indicating numbers such as 43 soldiers unaccounted for, rather than Holwell's much larger toll. Why these differences? There are multiple possible explanations, beginning with the simple chaos of summer 1756. Record-keeping in colonial outposts could be erratic. Lists might be incomplete, names misspelled or duplicated, and detachments of soldiers moving between posts would complicate any post-facto accounting. Some prisoners might have been held in other rooms or removed at different times. Others may have fled the city during the panic. Some may have been killed in the streets or in small skirmishes outside the fort, and therefore would not have been part of a single confinement event. There is also the possibility of genuine exaggeration. Holwell had reason to ensure his account had moral and political force. He was a survivor who suffered. The horror he described would naturally carry the emotional truth of terror and loss. At the same time, his narrative, published in London, was useful to those who wished to rally public sentiment against Siraj and to justify a stronger British response in Bengal. These are not mutually exclusive possibilities. The historiographical debate over the black hole often hinges less on whether suffering occurred that night. The human reality of cramped, hot, frightening conditions for those confined is hard to deny, and more on the scale and context of that suffering. Holwell's vivid scene may be accurate in tone while overstating headcounts. Alternatively, gaps in other records may undercount those present. Scholars attentive to primary documents argue that the methodological task is to reconcile testimony with administrative evidence while recognizing the limits of both. To bring the debate into sharper focus, let us return step by careful step to the night itself, reconstructing the sensory experience according to the available testimony and making clear when a detail rests primarily on Holwell's narrative. The cell was, by all accounts, small. Holwell described its dimensions and the presence of iron bars on a single aperture. Outside, fires burned in the compound. The monsoon climate amplified heat and humidity. Sweat and breath compounded the stifling air within. Holwell's account emphasizes the sensory progression. First discomfort, then confusion, then a rising panic as oxygen thinned. He recounts that water was scarce. A few men tried to pass small quantities through the bars to the trapped, but the volume could do little to relieve the mounting distress. At one point, a man named Mr. Bailey, described in Holwell's narrative as a figure trying to maintain order, organized attempts to prioritize access to the window and to manage the crowd. Gradually, bodies began to collapse. Men who could no longer stand were left where they fell. As hours passed, the room's noise ebbed into a ghastly quiet, breathless, groaning, and then silence. In Holwell's telling, dawn brought the opening of the door and the sight of devastation. He described survivors staggering into the morning air, bodies laid upon the floor, rescue and removal of the dead. Holwell reported 23 survivors emerging from 146 confined, numbers that, if accepted at face value, indicate a mortality rate of devastating proportions. Again, this is Holwell's narrative. Others present in and around Fort William at the time left fragmentary notes that confirm deaths and suffering but disagree in scale and placement. Some observers recorded instances of summary executions and street violence during the capture of the city, suggesting that not all fatalities must be assigned to that single room. Contemporary accounts from Indian sources capture the assault and its immediate military consequences more than they dwell on the precise number of men cramped in a guardroom. The immediate political consequence of Holwell's published account was significant. When news reached London, it was seized upon by politicians and pamphleteers. The image of helpless British subjects crowded into a dark cell and left to die became a rallying point. Outrage was harnessed to moralize and to demand action. The event served as a moral justification for military responses that followed, including the counterattacks led by company figures in the subsequent year. The narrative strengthened the sense among many Britons that their countrymen in India were vulnerable and oppressed, lending a rhetorical weight to imperial policy. But as the 19th and then the 20th century moved forward, historians started to ask sharper questions, not merely about the feelings stirred by the story, but about the facts. Mid-20th century historians and archival researchers turned to muster rolls, payroll documents, and other administrative records, attempting to piece together an independent count. Their work suggested several important points. First, lists recovered from company archives do not support a straightforward count of 146 people, confined on a single night in a single room. The numbers on various rolls, combined with the personnel present in Calcutta at that time, leave a smaller number of men who could plausibly have been crammed into that guardroom. Second, some men reported missing later do not appear on any surviving muster, implying that contemporary administrative listings were incomplete. Third, alternative reconstructions proposed that the fatal event might have included a smaller group, estimates around 64, who were confined for a shorter period, or that the confinement itself might have been part of a broader sequence of abuses and killings across the captured city. Several methodological caveats arise when interpreting these reconstructions. Muster rolls could be wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with intentional falsification. Names were often recorded imprecisely. Personnel could be posted to detached duty in remote locations before a muster, and records might have been lost or intentionally destroyed in the turmoil. Conversely, Holwell's account, while detailed, was written after the fact and published in a political environment that rewarded sensational testimony. Holwell had been a sufferer and a survivor. Survivors' memories can be distorted by trauma, and the desire to convey moral meaning can shape the way events are remembered and reported. That does not mean Holwell lied. Rather, it suggests the need for caution in treating a single narrative as definitive. Beyond numbers, historians have debated motive and intent. Was the confinement an act of deliberate cruelty intended to kill, or the result of negligence and indifference? Did the Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dawla, order the confinement to be lethal, or did troops and local guards act without direct orders from him? Primary sources do not yield unequivocal answers. Contemporary correspondence and later testimony suggest that Siraj was angry and wanted to assert authority, that he intended to punish those he saw as transgressors, and that he may have sanctioned the detaining of prisoners. Yet direct orders to kill by suffocation are not documented in the same way Holwell's account of suffering is. Historians therefore frame intent as contested. Some suggest malice on the part of the Nawab or his commanders, others point to confusion, a failure of camp discipline, and the chaotic nature of war during which abuses can occur without the direct instruction of a distant leader. The weight of the evidence, in short, does not allow a decisive judgment on motive, but it does make clear that violence and fatalities occurred in the context of conquest and disorder. Another important point in the historiography is how the story was used politically. Whether or not Holwell's exact figures were accurate, his narrative served a political function. It was utilized in Britain to justify a moral crusade, an outrage that could be translated into financial and military support for the company's campaigns. The memory of the black hole became a rhetorical tool that helped to legitimate subsequent British actions in Bengal and beyond. Monuments and memorials later commemorated the alleged victims and kept the story alive in imperial consciousness. Fort William, the original fort that had stood during the 1756 capture, was replaced by a larger and more modern installation, a physical testament to the changed balance of power. The symbolic weight of the black hole fed into narratives of British suffering, perseverance and eventual dominion. But there is a caution here about how memory and historiography intertwine. The emotional truth of Holwell's account, the terror, the claustrophobia, the deaths, must be respected. We cannot reduce human suffering to dry numbers and archival disputes without losing the moral gravity of what human beings endured. At the same time, treating a single testimony as the only truth risks flattening a complex event into a simple moral fable that obscures other facets: the role of local actors, the presence of street violence during the capture, the administrative confusion, and the longer history of company intrusion that set the scene. So what might a balanced reconstruction look like based on the evidence and the careful caveats historians have raised? One plausible reading is as follows. During the capture of Calcutta on June 20, 1756, several dozen British soldiers, company officials and civilians were rounded up and placed in a small guardroom. Conditions inside were appalling: heat, overcrowding, limited ventilation, and scarce water combined to create a deadly environment for some. A number of those confined died overnight. Several dozen recovered or were rescued the next morning. Holwell, having survived and bearing a traumatic memory, published a detailed narrative in which he estimated the total number confined and the number who died. These figures were repeated and amplified, becoming central to the black hole story. Later researchers, examining muster rolls and other records, found fewer names to support Holwell's exact count. They proposed lower totals and suggested that not all fatalities could be attributed solely to a single roomed confinement. Nevertheless, the moral core of Holwell's narrative, the image of men crowded into an airless room and many not surviving the night, remains plausible even as numbers and contexts are adjusted. It is worth emphasizing the limits of certainty here. The record is incomplete. The political stakes at the time shaped how stories were told and received. Survivors' memories are invaluable yet vulnerable to distortion, and administrative records are useful but imperfect. Historians therefore speak of the black hole as both a real episode of suffering and as a contested historical account whose details should be treated with caution. That duality, emotional truth and empirical uncertainty, is central to the lasting lesson of the black hole story. The night of June 20th, 1756, whether it involved 146 people or a smaller number, was a moment of human catastrophe for those trapped and their families. Their suffering deserves acknowledgement and remembrance. At the same time, the ways in which Holwell's account shaped British public memory reveal how singular narratives can be amplified into national myths, used to justify policy, and reshaped into monuments and official histories that sometimes obscure more than they illuminate. The legacy of the black hole is thus twofold. On one level, it is the personal and immediate one: survivors, witnesses, and the dead whose fate was sealed by a brutal night. On another level, it is a testament to the mechanics of historical memory, how eyewitness testimony, political interest, and archival fragments combine to produce a story that takes on a life of its own. Fort William was later rebuilt. The episode became part of the repertoire of British imperial narratives. Memorials and histories kept the story in circulation. Scholars since the mid-20th century have worked to complicate that reception history, showing that the event was used to justify later actions and that its most dramatic numerical claims are open to question. What then is the terrifying truth behind the black hole of Calcutta? The investigation yields a nuanced answer. The terrifying element, the human horror of men crowded into a tiny airless space, suffering and some dying, is supported by consistent testimony about conditions. The truth that must be unveiled is not simply a single, incontrovertible number, but a composite realization. That atrocity and neglect occurred in a highly charged, violent context. That a single eyewitness account, powerfully told, helped to frame and magnify that suffering, and that later efforts to correct or revise details do not erase the underlying human cost. Equally important is recognizing that history is made from fragments. Different documents, recollections, and motives intersect to create a narrative whose parts sometimes resist neat reconciliation. When we close our eyes and return to that cramped room for the final time, we should remember both the sensory account, the heat, the breathlessness, the arms pressing against one another, and the methodological caution that follows historians into archives. We keep the horror at the center of our moral attention, while refusing the temptation to accept as absolute every number or every rhetorical use of the event. To tell the story responsibly is to hold both the grief and the uncertainty at once. If you want to explore the sources behind this investigation, there are accessible collections of company records, contemporary pamphlets, and modern scholarly studies that pass the muster rolls and analyze Holwell's pamphlets. For a deeper dive into the archival debates and the social history of mid-18th century Bengal, follow the recommended playlist and check the description for source lists and further reading. June 20th, 1756. A small dark room, a crowd of prisoners, the sharp ache of thirst and heat, a morning that revealed a scene of death and survival. That is the emotional core of the black hole. The terrifying truth behind it is both confirmed and complicated by the documentary record. Confirmed in the sense that suffering undeniably occurred, complicated in the sense that the scale, precise sequence, and motives remain subjects of careful historical scrutiny. Holding those two facts together, moral clarity about human suffering and empirical humility about contested details, is the closest we can come to uncovering the event's full meaning. If this examination left you wanting more context or sources, click through to the playlist that unpacks the archives and historiographical debates in greater detail. And if you found this investigation useful, subscribe for more episodes that balance vivid narrative with careful historical inquiry.